There's an interest in the idea of neuroscience because neuroscience is the study of the brain, and if we want to really get at why people are doing things, why they behave the way they do, then you go to the source, right? If you could actually measure it directly in the brain, then you could bypass all of their inability to tell you what's going on. So I think that that's sort of the interest in the topic and why I'm excited about this evening. In addition,
so I would say we're all psychologists. We all have a lot of theories about people's behavior. Often the behavior of the people closest to us, some of which they will and some of which they won't agree with. The thing I would say about what's happened recently in terms of neuroscience is that customers as well as businesses have learned to think differently about their brains. So their lay psychology, all of us are lay psychologists, even Joe is a lay psychologist when he's not being Dr. Joe, and his explanation of the behavior of things around him, of course, is much more informed by neuroscience than the rest of us, but we are all getting these ideas. And there are two consequences, I think, of that. One of them is, there's a guy called Anthony Giddens who came up with this concept, which is the most complicated phrase I can reliably remember, and that is the double hermeneutic. And I don't know if anyone's heard of the double hermeneutic, but basically it means you cannot have a theory about human beings' behavior without changing their behavior. So once upon a time, there was no such thing called stress. I promise you, there was no such thing called stress. About 1955, a guy called Hans Seeley publishes a book about the stress response and all sorts of other feelings people have previously had. Nerves, people used to suffer from nerves. You all look far too young to even have elderly relatives who suffer from their nerves, but I am not so young. All of those things got brought in and repackaged as stress. But the moment that you've talked about stress as stress, you've changed subtly how it's caused, because stress sounds like something else that someone else, possibly someone who could be sued, is responsible for, that's happening to you. It's not about you and your weaknesses and your nerves. So if you have a theory about people, you change people. And I think customers, consumers, are also learning all of this. And so when they respond to advertising or when they don't, they may be thinking themselves a little bit more about what triggers businesses are trying to pull with them. And I think that's it's important to understand how psychology informs the general discourse, as it is about a cunning new Smersh-like plan that we can use to seize an area of the market or grab some more value.
so I'm curious then, because I totally agree that the psychology is directly relevant because it's understanding behavior and causes of behavior. Do you think then that the neuroscience is relevant to business?
This was something I was questioning. When I first got approached this, I was like, well, in case you hadn't guessed, I know very little about neuroscience. And I don't know that much about brand psychology officially either, so I questioned whether I should actually be sat with you guys rather than sat up here. But what we do know is that, neuroscience, I think, is a great it's a way for us to sort of build a bigger picture, like you say, like why are things happening, what is going on in the brain, and why is this kind of response happening? It feels like it's a great base to build from, but to really understand and build something from a brand perspective that's going to be useful, from either a rebrand in our case, or just trying to connect to an audience or understand your audience. It feels that brand psychology is a richer area, particularly for businesses from a small and medium size as well. So for us, even getting over that hump first of, once you understand that if you can get your sales director or your MD to understand that people make a decision from their guts first and then back it up with rational thought, that's the biggest step as well. And once you get into that, you can actually open it up into, how do we affect behavior? How can we influence it? Rebranding a company isn't going to change behavior. We can't actually control people. We can just seek to influence it.
And I'm curious to the extent that psychology and neuroscience, perhaps in particular, are relevant to sort of small to medium-sized enterprises who don't have 6, 7, 8-figure R&D budgets. Is it just that those of us who are in those areas can benefit from knowing these things? Or are there tools and methods that still are relevant to companies on that kind of a scale?
Yeah, I think there's something that's turning them off the brand, or the competitor's doing something better, Or is it the fact that the high street is just something that they always go to for cards and gifts and flowers? They don't trust an online retailer. But you can't just presume all that. You've got to test it and know, is that right? Is that hypothesis right? So, yeah, the research was key to us. For us, it was about making sure that we're making a valid decision. Or, you know, it's not just so you can go to the board and say, we're doing this and this is why. It's actually getting to know your customers, like I said before, understanding what people like about your brands. And we found out that our customers loved the fact that we were fun and light-hearted and accessible, and they trusted us as well. But we also found out that non-users of the brand found us that fun to be gimmicky. They looked at us and they thought, it's a bit naff, it's not a brand for me. And also there's a really weird thing that people see the cards or the gifts or the flowers online, their quality perception is here, and then when they go on, their presumption before they go online is here, when they go online it's here, and then when they receive the product it goes way up. There's a surprise, there's a presumption that our flowers were low quality, even though they're the same supplier as M&S or Interflora. And so there's all these perceptions really interesting. Of course, the key thing for us is between the second and third stage, the person buying the product may not ever see it because they're buying it for someone else. So you've got two customers here as well, and you're trying to get into both those mindsets. The key to it is, if you wanted to sort of take what you take into a medium or small business, it's that ability, even on a small scale, to test, like you say, to understand, to get to know what people are thinking and how they're approaching things. You can surprise yourself. Even a simple, small test can really throw up things that you presumed, because the people making the decision in the business have their own perceptions as well about the business, and we had to realize that those of us in the business weren't necessarily our customers, and that what we thought was right wasn't necessarily true.
I think it really is important that we understand that people do or don't understand what's going on with something important. And sometimes the best way to find out is to ask them to explain in their own words. And not follow up, and not have too many answers that we can turn into data with 7-point scales. Because sometimes actually just listening to those 10 or 12 people, you know, the penny dropped for us and we understood what the issue was. And by the way, they were using all the right words. They just were using them in the wrong order, and their conceptual structure was hole in the ozone.
Very interesting discussion, thanks to the panel. As a neuroscientist, I don't often get out to events like these, but clearly there's a lot of interest in neuroscience. I think there's mutual benefit in increasing communication between academia and the corporate world. What I'd like to ask the panel is, how can we further facilitate that communication? I know there's others that feel like Joe and I do, that neuroscience should be taking a more active role in providing some of the information and supporting events like these and corporate institutions. I'd just like to get your take on how we can be more effective at that.
I think it's partly about having something that's really viable, I think, for sometimes. I think that it can be, I don't know, intimidating to people in the corporate world that, you know, scientists are coming into their world and sort of tell them what to do and things. I think that what it needs to be is a package of, this is what it can do, this is where it can be applied, and this is how you can use it to really benefit your business. Because sometimes I think it has been a kind of it's not been something that could be dialed into other aspects of people's business. Like we've got businesses have behavioural data, businesses do quantitative research and qualitative research. I think it's more about providing another frame, another perspective on consumers rather than maybe something that instead of. And I think that making that viable and being able to use it in the context of other methodologies is really important.
Earlier in the panel discussion, we did talk a little bit about some of the barriers to trying to establish these kind of relationships, and it's something that's particularly near and dear to my heart because I think there are a lot. But I obviously see it from one perspective. I'd be curious to see what you guys think are the barriers to, you know, using psychology and neuroscience in ways beyond what you're currently doing. What are the things that make it hard to do that?
KPIs, I guess. It's as simple as that, isn't it? It's the classic. If you're trying to get the accounts team or your MD or anyone to sign off on it, it's what is the KPI? And if there's good case studies, if there's great rationale behind bring it in either as part, like you say, part of the mix, or as itself as a best practice, or a starting point even, then suddenly it becomes very viable.
As if you all met together in some secret congress. But I mean, it would be great if there were some agreed ways of talking about certain things. So every time anyone talks about localization of function in the brain, they offend 1/2 or 2/3 of psychologists by making the wrong division between left and right brain, whether it's localization of function or systemic nature of function. By the way, the public loves left brain, right brain, because that's a list of categories which numbers 2, which most people can hold in their heads. I've lost count of the number of assertions about the qualities of the left brain or the right brain, and even the meme, which is 2 halves of the brain with different colours, often, interestingly, with the male side on the left-hand side being blue and the right side being pink. That was a new development. I hadn't seen that until today. I was very struck by that. But anyway, the point is, people have got hold of that one. It may be profoundly unhelpful in many ways, but nevertheless, it's something that people can remember. At the moment, there's a guy called Robert Lustig, who really fired the starting gun on the sugar thing. Like, lots of people have tried to get people excited about sugar and metabolic syndrome. They've failed, but this guy really kind of took off. You may have seen he had 4.5–5 million views on YouTube for a 2.5-hour academic lecture. He is making it very simple. He is saying, as if there were only, but he is talking about 3 neurotransmitter pathways in the brain. One for dopamine, which is the pleasure one, but pleasure in a kind of way. One for serotonin, which is pleasure in a kind of blissed out way. And then the third, which is cortisol and stress and anxiety. Now, most people can remember 3. And I think having frameworks which people can grasp is really, really helpful, but it's also very dangerous because academics always end up fighting over how misleading that particular simplification is. That's one thing. Then the second thing I'd say on a shorter basis is more people need to get more education in this area. I think a lot of what you learn in psychology as an undergraduate should really be taught to everybody, because it's like having an owner's manual for your brain. And it seems to me profoundly wrong that we don't teach people how compound interest works. I mean, my training is in psychology and accounting, so I have 2 recommendations for the education of the young. but one of them is we must teach people basic financial concepts. And the second is we should teach people about how the brain works. Just a little bit, because then it would be much, much easier to engage with people later on when they've chosen to have careers in business.
I mean, one of the things that that certainly motivates me is the question: where do you guys go when you want to get this information? So, if you didn't do a psych degree as an undergrad, and your MD is in a psych degree major, how do you get the kind of information about psychology and neuroscience that might be useful, and how do you package that in a way that is easily communicated and practical as well? So it's not only valid, because I think that this is where neuroscientists get it wrong, is that we spend a lot of time worrying about the details and not that much time thinking about how you would actually take some of the bigger picture principles and apply them in ways that would be useful. So while I will absolutely happily argue with anyone about left brain, right brain, I'm not sure that that's that helpful. But so that's something that I find really interesting. And I'm curious. I'd love to talk to people about it afterwards. If you're looking for that information, how do you even go about finding it?
There's been quite a lot of movement around sort of behavioural economics providing those sort of ideas. They are taking some aspects of neuroscience and packaging them. I mean, I'm thinking about I think it's David Halpern at the Cabinet Office, or was at the Cabinet Office, that set up some behavioural insights team, and they use a mnemonic basically called Mindspace, which takes the key findings of behavioural economics based to some degree on neuroscience and tries to package them in a way that helps policymakers and corporate people think about what could be affecting people's behaviour. So that's quite a good place to start. There's also another one called EAST that people use, but yeah, I don't think that neuroscience in particular has done a particularly good job of packaging it in those kind of ways that just simply says, okay, if you're thinking about running a campaign or starting a policy, what are the things you need to think about?
A bit of context, I run a social enterprise called Behaviour Change, so obviously I'm quite interested in what you're talking about. We're particularly interested in changing behaviour for the better. Unfortunately, quite a lot of people have a bit of a vested interest in it remaining a bit of a black box. You know, I'd be interested in your sort of viewpoint on the extent to which it's difficult for other people to access it, because a lot of the people who are actively talking about it are trying to do so in a way that kind of serves their purposes, I suppose.
Andy, I think you kind of touched on this earlier. You want to?
I think that the people that have really worked hard at making it more open to other people has been sort of behavioural economics, and you talked about Richard Thaler and you talked about Daniel Kahneman, and they have worked to try and make it simple, a list of things that you can go through, and I think that is a good step forward. I think that it is sort of counterintuitive, some of the stuff that comes out of it, some of the rules or some of the ideas about how our brains work, and we have to work quite hard. Even when you learn about a lot of this stuff, you're still a human in the world, and you still do the things that you maybe have learned about and know that the behavioural economists say, this is what affects people's behaviour, but you're powerless to stop it in and of yourself. So I think that it's a good step forward to have some people in the world trying to package it a bit better, but I think that there needs to be some work on the other side to sort of learn about it, apply it, test it, use it within businesses, use it within educational contexts or in social enterprise, because it's not easy stuff to pick up and use. Even when they put it in a list, you've got to work out how that applies to your context. So it's not you can't necessarily just take it off the shelf.
The most powerful brands in social sciences often are people who explain things. And when we had a chat on the phone last week to meet each other, and we were reflecting on the fact that behavioural economics actually took 35 years to break through. Well, sorry, it's 35 years ago that the first journal articles were being published. It breaks through really because of Danny Kahneman. Now, it wouldn't have existed without his kind of relationship with Amos Tversky, which is described brilliantly in Michael Lewis's new book. Not that I have any interest in Michael Lewis or his publisher, but that relationship is really, really interesting in terms of how new ideas come out. But we should also be interested in why did it take so long for this to become mainstream? And the answer is Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow was a fantastic breakthrough bestseller, and it got people talking. And one of the fastest ways to challenge black box thinking is to have enough general knowledge, or for general knowledge to be expanded sufficiently to start challenging people, saying, look, I don't need to know 5 significant figures, but just tell me roughly how does this work? And I have been surprised at how difficult it is meeting people where I work and beyond, clients, other companies, other consulting firms, to get people to explain in simple terms that I could understand how something works. There's a guy called, back to my bête noire about finance, there's a guy called John Norton, who's really worth reading, who pointed out after the crash that there are loads of people who hold respectable positions, run TV channels, edit newspapers, who almost boast of their innumeracy. And why should it be at all good not to understand how the financial system works? I mean, not in the finest details of derivatives, but just roughly what is going on. It's crazy not to know that, and it's crazy to be enumerate, but people are quite cheerful about saying that. I think it's not so cool to say that you don't understand anything about psychology now. But still the pendulum can move forward, and most of all, you just need 1 or 2 great popularizers.
In academia, our culture is such that
Greenwich Time Lady was the 3rd in a family business who carried time to customers who wanted accurate time, brought on a watch from Greenwich, called Ruth Belville. Really, really Google this one, it's great. But the fact is, by this point, everyone had their own watches, and their timekeeping was good enough for it to be really stupid to subscribe to an ambulatory time service, but people still did. So there is an overlay period where people keep on doing the old thing because people pay them to do it. I mean, if you're in professional services, you need to be very strong-willed to say, I'm terribly sorry, but that isn't the thing you want, and it's very nice of you to commission it, but we're not going to do it. And quite a lot of people resist that. The other thing I would say is that half a loaf is better than none. You do get quite a lot of indication sometimes when you're massively wrong from just asking customers even a badly phrased question. The last thing I would say is it isn't true really that System 2 solely is responsible for answering surveys. You know, your Saturdays or eye movements have already scanned the question before you're aware of it, and the answer is bubbling up from beneath without you thinking about it. You hear yourself say it. You may even rationalise why you said it. It may be the fact you just like a pattern going down the middle, slightly skewed to the right. Who knows? But most of the processing will not have been in your conscious mind. Only if you are really, really interested in Likert scales and the construction of surveys would you possibly professionally employ all of System 2 thinking about that survey. And that goes for most things we do. And I would add, we train the brain that does that without our permission, by our experiences and by the things we learn how to do. So it's not as if there's no involvement in that, it's just it was a long time in the past. It's why the Jesuits try to get hold of children, you know, by the age of 7 or 8, because if you can train in certain things, that System 1 brain will take. It's not a wild, untrained animal that has never known civilization that you can't control. It is the sum total of all of your learned reactions to things. It's just you don't see it on the screen.